Hi again, Mark here from TalkingBass.net. This week I'm going to be giving you a simple walking bass line through a very basic jazz blues progression. We'll play through it so you can get it under your fingers, and I'll also be giving a bit of a breakdown of what's going on in there so you can integrate parts of it into your own vocabulary and develop your own walking style. As ever, the lesson material is all available over at TalkingBass.net. Just follow the link in the info below. You'll be able to download the tab and sheet music for this bass line along with all the relevant backing tracks. Then while you're over there, remember to check out the lesson map where you'll find over 100 different video lessons on all aspects of bass playing, and it's all systemized and categorized for ease of navigation. Then if you want a little extra, just subscribe for free to gain access to the members area where you can find all kinds of different practice resources and ebooks. So go check it out. Okay, so this walking bass line works over a basic, quick change 12-bar blues progression in the key of C. And I've provided 3 different backing tracks in the downloadable lesson material. So we've got 3 different tempos. We've got 100 beats per minute, 150 beats per minute, and 200 beats per minute, okay? So I'm just going to play through the bass line, and we'll play through it at the medium tempo of 150 beats per minute, okay? So here's the bass line. Okay, so you can download the tab and sheet music and the backing track and then work through this in your own time because it will take a little while to memorize it. I'm going to work through it note by note, phrase by phrase, and give you lots of little tips on memorizing it, but you know, you will have to try and do this in your own time, you know, and because it will take time to do that. So first of all, let's have a look at the chord progression. That's our first port of call. So you can see there it's in the key of C. And we have a bar of C7, then we have another bar of F7. That's where we have this quick change, because some of the blues progressions might have that C7 for 4 bars. So we've got that quick change of moving to F7, and then we're back to C7 for 2 bars. So that's chord 1, then chord 4, and then chord 1 for 2 bars. Then we have chord 4 again, the F7, we have that for 2 bars. Then we have C7 again for 2 bars. Then we have that descending common chord progression of G7 to F7, so it's chord 5 to chord 4, and then we're back to chord 1, and then finally a turnaround on chord 5, which is the G7. Now, if you don't know what any of that meant, and it all just sounds confusing to you, then I'd highly recommend working through some of the basic blues lessons that I've released on YouTube and TalkingBass.net. I've linked to them in the info below, and they work through all the different blues progressions from a basic bare bones blues all the way through to an advanced jazz blues. So work through those, and it should all make perfect sense. So on the face of it, probably the easiest way to learn this is to download the tab and then just learn it note for note, you know, as a string of notes. But that's not always the easiest way to memorize it, because when you do that, you're basically going to be looking at this long string of notes, you know, so it's 12, there's only 12 bars of it, but still, it can just look like this long procession of notes, and it can just take ages, you know, because it's this long linear line, and all the notes, there's no repetition, it's just, you know, contour moving up and down, up and down. So one of the biggest tips I've got for learning this is to learn it in smaller fragments. Now, the fragments are best being 1 per chord. So if you were to look at the first line, we've got a bar of C7. So that's your first fragment. Then the second bar, F7, there's the second fragment. We learned that one. Then you've got C7 for 2 bars. Learn that as a separate fragment. So it's not necessarily 1 bar, you know, learning 1 bar at a time. You're learning however many there are for a chord. Now, as well as helping with the memorization of the whole thing, that also helps with developing your vocabulary for, you know, learning walking bass lines, because every single one of those little fragments, if it's based on a chord, is going to be a little phrase that will work every time you see that chord or that chord movement, you know, that chord progression. So for instance, if we're looking at the first bar, C7 to F7, if we learn that line, you know, we learn that as a fragment in itself, that's a little fragment that we can, you know, put there in the mental toolbox, and we can just use every single time we see that movement, you know, that chord movement from C to F, or upper perfect fourth, you know, 2 dominant 7 chords, we can use it every time. So we're developing our vocabulary like this. So that's the first tip. Learn it in smaller chunks and then just put those chunks together. Now, the second tip that I would have for working on this is to know the appropriate chord tones or arpeggios and scales. Now, I know that for some of you, you're instantly going to be thinking, oh no, not scales and arpeggios again. But bear with me because it can really, really help with memorizing things like this. And it is essential in learning how to play walking bass lines. If you're thinking, oh, I'd like to learn walking bass lines, and then, somebody like me starts talking about scales and arpeggios, and you think, oh, I don't want to do this. I just wanted to learn how to play walking bass lines. Well, I've got news for you. You're going to need to learn the arpeggios and the scales. There is no way around it because it's an improvising art, and you need to know the lay of the land. You need to know the harmonic landscape so that you can work around it, because the main thing that we're doing in a walking bass line is outlining the harmony. So if we don't know what the harmony is, we ain't going to be able to outline it. Now, as much as scales and arpeggios and all that are important for learning how to improvise and construct your own walking bass lines, they're also really important in memorizing something like this, as you'll see as I work through it. And one of the reasons for this is because it means if you already have the arpeggios and the scales there logged in the mind, then every time you see a line in this, you can relate it back to one of those patterns that you already know, okay? So as a very, very simple example, if we were learning a walking bass line, or any bass line really, that was working over, let's say, a C7 chord, and the bass line sounded like this, I could learn that by thinking, oh, it's just a C7 arpeggio up and down, rather than thinking, okay, well, it's going to be the notes C, E, G, B flat. If you didn't know a C7 arpeggio, you would just be learning the notes as a string of notes. C, E, G, B flat, C, B flat, G. And it could take you ages because then you're just learning every note as an individual note away from everything else. There's no context in there. If you know a C7 arpeggio, you just think, oh, C7 arpeggio. Now, as well as, learning an arpeggio or seeing an arpeggio just as a standalone thing like that, you can also relate everything around it to the arpeggio. So if you've got something that works up like the first line in the bass line there, that's over a C7, we think, okay, C, E, G, that's the first part of the C7 arpeggio. I'm working up the arpeggio, and then I've just got these little two notes in there to lead back to the F. So at all times, I'm relating it back to something that I've already got logged in there. So it's a lot easier to memorize. If you had a piece that was just a bunch of arpeggios, one after the other, it would be so much easier to just be able to say, okay, well, that's a G major arpeggio, that's an E flat major arpeggio, blah, 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 rather than learning it note by note by note by note. The more things that you learn, the more music that you learn, the easier it is to learn more music because there's more stuff in there for you to relate it back to. So, with all of that in mind, we've only got 3 chords to worry about in this whole progression: C7, F7, and G7. So, you need to know the C7, F7, and G7 arpeggios. Okay, so C7, that's C, E, G, B flat. F7, F, A, C, E flat. And G7, G, B, D, F. G, B, D, F. And learn those patterns, okay? Now, I've got plenty of lessons on YouTube and Talking Bass that deals with this, so I won't waste time going through the dominant 7 arpeggios. But, needless to say, it's just their root, 3rd, 5th, flat 7. And I'm putting the octave in. Okay, so that's the dominant 7 arpeggios. Now, also, in terms of scale movement, usually with something like this, you're going to be looking at Mixolydian scales. Now, don't worry about, Greek names and modes and all that kind of stuff. All a Mixolydian scale is a major scale with a flattened 7th. So, you should know a C major scale, so C, D, E, F, G, A, B, C, okay? All you do is you take the B, the 7th, and you drop it down 1 fret down to a B flat. So we have C, D, E, F, G, A, B flat, C, okay? And you can see from that a C7 arpeggio is related to that Mixolydian scale. All of those notes are in there. C, E, G, B flat, C, D, E, F, G, A, B flat, you know. It's in there, it's kind of the skeleton of that scale. So you need to know the C Mixolydian scale, F Mixolydian, and G Mixolydian. Okay, so that's what we're going to be using as our palette of notes for the scale movement. As well as the chord tones and the scales, there's also a lot of chromatic movement in this bass line. Don't worry about that too much. All that means is that we join up the scale notes. You know, a chromatic note is going to be anything in between those scale notes in there. And we'll be, you know, I'll be looking at that as we work through. All we do is use those to add a little bit of spice in there and also to make up the beats sometimes, you know, because we've got 4 beats in a bar, and sometimes you just use chromatic notes to bring yourself back round to fill in the gaps, okay? But that'll all make sense as we're working through. So now I'll work through the bass line note by note and phrase by phrase, and I'll always be relating it back to those scales and arpeggios that I just worked through. So the first line, so we've got this first little fragment, this first bar is over a C7, okay? And we're going to be looking at the notes C, E, G, G flat. And I'm also going to include the first note of the next bar, the F, okay? And I'll explain why in a second. So just in terms of the notes, C, E, G, G flat, F. And if you need to know the frets, it's 3rd fret of the A string there, and then everything's on the D string after that. We've got 2, 5, 4, 3, okay? So, C, E, G, G flat, F, okay? Now the reason that I used included the F, the first note of the next bar, is because for every single chord that you have in a piece of music that you're playing a walking bass line through, you should always be looking at 2 chords at all times. So for that first bar, instead of seeing C7, I will see C7 to F7, okay? You see it as 2 chords. And because what you have to do then is connect those 2 chords. If you're only looking at it as C7, you're just going to be, you could just, you know, be playing a line that has no kind of relevance to the F, you know. And what we're actually doing is making a journey. If any of you have seen in my other walking bass line lessons, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about here. We're making a journey. We're making a journey from C to F, okay, which is why you see the 2 chords, one after the other. So also, in terms of memorizing this, it gives us 2 waypoints, okay? So instead of it just being this long string of notes, you know, even if we ignored all the arpeggio stuff and scales and all that kind of thing, instead of having, you know, so many notes to learn, we can actually break it down to these waypoints. So we're thinking C to F. If we already know that there's the C to the F, which, let's face it, is easy to memorize because it's just the chords in the chord progression, then we've only got 3 notes to look at in between those 2 waypoints. So we can see that it's that C there to that F there. And that helps with memorizing, okay? So in terms of a breakdown of that first bar, we've actually just got a C7 arpeggio that we're working around. C, E, G, that's the first 3 notes of the arpeggio. Root 3rd 5th, or root major 3rd perfect 5th, and then we just use a little chromatic passing note to bring us down to that F, you know, the first note of the next bar, or the root note of the next chord. So there's nothing clever about this. We've just gone up because we're heading towards the F. We've gone past it, we've shot past it, and then we've thought, oh, okay, we've gone past it, we need to come back. Ooh, how are we going to do that? We could have used the E, but no. It's a little bit jazzier and a little bit more spice to use the chromatic passing note. And with all these chromatic passing notes that I've got in this bass line, the way to look at these is that we generally put them on weak beats in passing. Because if you were to play C to that G flat or F sharp there, you can hear it's a very dissonant interval. And if that was playing over the C7, you know, and you just, if you were to highlight that G flat, it'd sound very dissonant and odd. But when we put it in passing, it just gives us that nice kind of stepwise motion. You know, it just passes us by and it doesn't have time to set in on the ear. And because it's on a weak beat, because it's on the 4th beat, you know, the 2nd and the 4th beat being the weak ones in there, there's no real, you know, the ear's not drawn to it. If it was on the first beat, then yes, it would, you know, it'd get highlighted, but it's not. 1, 2, 3, 4, and it's just leading into the next bar. So the next line is over the F7. So we're looking at F7 to C7. So we start with the F there, 3rd fret of the D string, and then we're going to be working down to the C, 3rd fret of the A string. So they're the 2 waypoints. So in between there we have we've got the F, then we have open A, then B flat, B natural, and then the C. So we've just dropped down to the 3rd of that chord. This is over an F7. So we've got the root, the 3rd, and then we just come up chromatically up to the C. So it's this nice little chromatic lead up, which is a very, very popular walking bass line technique, okay? You'll hear that kind of line all the time, and it gives rise to that kind of sounding line, okay? So that's all we've done. We've got the F to the C there, F, A, B flat, B, C, okay? And that's our next fragment. So now we've learned those first 2 fragments, we can just put them together, and this is key to learning these longer pieces like this, because now we've got those 2 parts. If you practice them in isolation, and then it's a lot easier to just put those 2 together. So now we have, okay? So very, very simple, you know, and then you can just go round and round that until you've got that memorized. So the next line is over a C7 again, and it's working from the C to the F. So we're starting on the C there, 3rd fret of the A string, and then we're eventually going to be working towards the F, 3rd fret of the D string. And all we do in this line is play the following. Okay, so that's the line that we're looking at. So we have C, E, G, A, B flat, A, G, G flat, F. Okay, so it's over 2 bars. So in terms of the frets, we have 3rd fret of the A string, then 2nd fret of the D string, 5th fret of the D string, 2nd fret of the G string, 3rd fret of the G string, 2nd fret of the G string, and then back down, 5th fret of the D string, and then we have 4th fret of the D string. So C, E, G, A, B flat, A, G, G flat, and down to F. Okay, so that's the line. Now, this line is a perfect example of how having a repertoire and vocabulary of phrases can help in memorizing. Now, that line, as you might have noticed, is a very common and popular kind of line that you might have heard in a lot of rock and roll tunes, like this. So that's a very, very well-known phrase, okay? So basically it's a C dominant 7 arpeggio that we work up, C, E, G, and we put the 6th in there, the A, okay? And it goes up to the 7th and then back down, okay? So that's possibly a line that you already know quite well. You know, you get that kind of thing. So this bass line is exactly that. C, E, G, A, B flat, A, G. We come down, but instead of going down to the E, we use that chromatic passing note again at the 4th fret of the D string, the G flat, to bring us smoothly into the F, okay? You know, it just runs smoothly into it. I could have used the E, but I wanted to add a little bit of that jazzy spice, and I also didn't want it to sound too much like that rock and roll bass line. So it takes on a little bit of a different character when you put that chromatic note in, okay? So that's that line. So now we can put those 3 phrases together, so it's 4 bars in total. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So because we learned each of those fragments, you know, in isolation, you know, and memorized those, it's much, much easier to just put them together, okay? Rather than learning C, E, G, G flat, F, A, B flat, you know, just as this long string of notes, okay? So put those together and just keep playing that round and round before you add the next couple of bars. The next line is 2 bars of F7, and it's F7 to C7, and we're working from the F there, 3rd fret of the D string, to the C, 3rd fret of the A string. So the line sounds like this. Okay, so first of all, just the notes. We have F, E flat, D, C. Okay, so that's 3rd fret of the D string, 1st fret of the D string, open D string, and then 3rd fret of the A string. And then we drop down to F, the 1st fret of the E string, then we come up, open A string, B flat, the 1st fret of the A string, and then B natural, 2nd fret of the A string. Okay, and that leads us up to C, 3rd fret of the A string. So F, E flat, D, C, F, A, B flat, B, C. Okay, and in terms of the scales and arpeggios, we've got pretty much an F mixolydian scale. So remember what I said, mixolydian, it's just a major scale with a flat and 7th. We come down, root note, then the flat and 7th there, 6th, the D, then the C, and then we drop down to the root note, then up to the 3rd, and then we've got the 4th, and then a sharpened 4th, again a chromatic passing note to lead smoothly into the C. Okay, so if you were to look at an F mixolydian scale, we'd have, just try playing that first just to get a grip on the actual pattern there, and then just come down it. And then drop down, and then come up. Okay, so if I was memorizing that, I would see that as working around that mixolydian scale. Next, we have another 2 bars of C7, and this time we're working from C to G7, okay? So we've got the C there, 3rd fret of the A string, and that's working its way up to the G, 5th fret of the D string, okay? Now this line is very similar to the rock and rolly type one that we just played earlier, that one, but this time, because we've got to get to the G, we need to add a few more notes in there. So the notes are C, E, F, F sharp, G, A, B flat, A, G. So it comes back round, and nice little turn at the top to just bring us back into G. So the line again. Okay, so in terms of the frets, we start on the A string, 3rd fret for the C, then we're on the D string, frets 2, 3, 4, 5, then up on the G string, frets 2, 3, 2, and then we're back to the 5th fret on the D string for the G. Okay, so once again, we're kind of working around a C mixolydian, C7 kind of thing. Root note, then 3rd, major 3rd that is, then 4th, sharp 4th, 5th. So we've got that little chromatic passing note in there to give it a little bit of a jazzy vibe. Then we're up onto the G string, 6th, flat 7, 6, and then back to the 5th there. Okay, 1, 3, 4, sharp 4, 5, 6, flat 7, 6, 5, in terms of the intervals in there, okay? So again, the first part of that line is really, really popular in walking bass lines. You know, we used it earlier on. It's that root, 3rd, 4th, sharp 4th, 5th. And then you might add 6, flat 7, 7, an octave. You know, that kind of thing. You just see it all the time. So you want to get it under your fingers and also pretty much into your eyes, you know, get to know that fretboard pattern, because you will see that a hell of a lot, and it really helps with memorizing. If you see it, you think, oh, that's that. So now we're up here at the G7, and I'll put these next 2 chords together. So we've got G7 down to F7. So, and then we're going to be working down to C7. So the waypoints are going to be G, F, and C. So G, 5th fret of the D string, F, 3rd fret of the D string, and then C, 3rd fret of the A string. Okay, so they're the little waypoints. We just need to fill the gaps in. So notes wise, we've got G, F, E, G, F. So 5th fret, 3rd fret, 2nd fret, 5th fret, and then 3rd fret, all on the D string, okay? And that's pretty much a G mixolydian scale that we're just coming down. Root, flat 7, 6, root, and then we're down to the F. And it's also, in terms of the actual movement there, we've got this little enclosure around the F, because it's so close. You know, G to F, it's only a whole step below, so we need to work within a very confined area, and that's where scales come in. Arpeggios are great for moving bigger distances. Scales and chromatic notes are good for moving in these tight little areas like this. So if you wanted to move down from G to F, instinctively it's worth thinking, okay, use a scale. So descended, and then thought, oh, we've gone past the F, let's shoot back up a bit, back to the G, just enclose it, like I've said before on one of the other lessons, it's a bit like a plane circling before it comes down to land. And we're on the F, okay? So that's the G7. Then for the F7, we're coming down from the F down to the C. So again, we come down on the F mixolydian. So we have F, E flat, D, D flat, C. Okay, so D string 3rd fret, 1st fret, and then on the A string 5th fret, 4th fret, 3rd fret. Okay, so, and like I say, that's coming down on mixolydian. We've got root note, flat 7, the 6th, and then we've got that chromatic passing note to work from the 6th down to the C. Okay, so and like I've said before, it gives it a little bit of a kind of jazzy spice in there, and just mix up the beats. 1, 2, 3, 4, and we can land there on the C in time, on the first beat. So let's put those two bars together. So we have G7 and then the F7. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, and always be thinking of those waypoints. Don't just think of it as a long linear line because you'll find it tougher to memorize. So you've got G to F to C. Okay, so journeys, movements from one chord to the next. So finally, we've got C7 to G7, okay, so I'll talk about both of these chords together. And the G7 there, the chord 5, that's used as a turnaround. And if you don't know anything about turnarounds, just look at my other blues lessons because I talk all about them in there. Basically, a turnaround brings us back round to the start. Chord 5 is the usual norm for doing that because chord 5's got so much of a pull back to the root notes, okay? So we've got chord 1 and chord 5. And the line sounds like this: C, E, F, F sharp, G, A, B flat, B, C. Okay? Okay, so you might instantly recognize that pattern because we've used it quite a few times. It's that pattern that I was talking about where we've got the root, the 3rd, 4th, sharp 4th, 5th, the very popular one. So we've basically gone from the C, dropped down to the 3rd, and then we've just worked our way up. So again, C, E, F, F sharp, G, A, B flat, B, C. So the C works up to the G, C, E, F, F sharp, G. So now we've got the root note for the next chord, and then we work up to the C, G, A, B flat, B, C. So again, in terms of the frets, 3rd fret of the A string down to the open E string, then 1st fret, 2nd fret, 3rd fret on the E string, and then open A string, then 1st fret, 2nd fret, 3rd fret on the A string, okay? And that brings us back round to the start, okay? So let's just play those final 4 bars together, okay? So starting from the G7, so 2, 3, 4. Okay, so see how when you learn them as individual fragments, it's much, much easier to put them together. You see that as the G7 fragment, and then that's the F7 fragment, and then there's the turnaround fragment, okay? And you just put them together, but you learn them in isolation originally. So before we play that bass line as a whole, let's just break it into 3 component parts now. So originally we learned each line for each chord. So we had the smaller fragments, each one working over an individual chord. And now, just as we did with that final 4 bars, we can break it up into 4-bar sections. So this is a really good way of learning larger pieces. Learn them as very small fragments, put the fragments together into larger fragments, and then put those fragments together. So we're just building up a picture. So first of all, here's the first 4 bars, okay? So 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay, so that was the first 4 bars. So you want to practice that round and round until that's, you know, fully memorized, rather than just trying to memorize the whole thing. Then for the second 4 bars, we had the following. Okay, so that's the second fragment. So you practice that round and round. And often, if you try playing through the whole thing, you know, if you tried it too soon, you'd find that there were parts of the bass line that you forget. And when you forget those little parts, then it's easier to go back and just practice that one fragment rather than going through the whole thing. You know, so if the problem was there within that, you know, within that fragment we've just looked at, you may be on the C7 part. Instead of playing through the whole thing, just play that fragment, you know. Oh, there's the problem, you know, that part, okay? And finally, once again, here's the last 4 bars. 1, 2, 3, 4. Okay? So now let's start putting those 3 fragments together. So first of all, let's just try the first 2 sets, okay? So this is going to be the first 8 bars, and that'll sound like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. So we just put those 2 fragments together. Okay, so that makes it, once again, a progressive step-by-step learning. And finally, let's put the whole thing together. So, 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, I'd advise you to practice working around that away from the tracks before trying with the track, okay? That's because you're going to be put under too much pressure to play. You know, when the track's going, it's amazing how much pressure that suddenly puts on you, and you can start forgetting things just because of the pressure. So you want to memorize that first, you know, and don't worry about your timing, you know, just, you know, because there's going to be parts of it that you know better than others, and when you get to those parts that you're not sure of, you're going to be thinking, oh, I don't know, you know, until you get it under your fingers, okay? So this is the same kind of thing that Jeff Berlin talks about with metronomes. You know, sometimes people will rush getting onto the metronome, but you're better off getting the bass line or whatever it is that you're learning under your fingers first before the added pressure of the rhythmic accuracy and the timing and, you know, that added pressure, okay? So once you have it under your fingers, you can start with the tracks. So here's the first track at 100 beats per minute. Now let's try 150 beats per minute. And finally, let's try 200 beats per minute, and this time I'll go round the chord progression twice. Because we've got the final line bringing us back round to the C there, that low C, we can just loop the bass line and just go round and round and round, okay? So I'll play it through twice, and this is 200 beats per minute. So, quick couple of tips on actually performing that bass line. First of all, if you're having any problems with the feel, make sure that you're using full held note durations, okay? So, it should sound like this. So, very slowly. Hear how each note leads into the next. There's no gaps in there at all. Okay? This is the polar opposite. Hear how that just will not groove. That just does not swing at all. Okay, so very detached notes. And, you know, even if they were a little longer, you know, that kind of thing, it just doesn't work. You need full held note durations. Okay, so that's the first tip. You've got to get that right. Also, try playing a little closer to the neck. Okay, so you're going to get more of that warmer sound, and also try playing a little lighter, because obviously as you come up here, if you start hitting too hard, it's going to start clanking and everything. So you want to play quite lightly up near the neck, you know, so you can play over the neck pickup, or, I mean, some people even play right over the neck. But yeah, get closer to the neck for that sound and play a little lighter. So that line will work if you need to play a walking bass line through that chord progression. Bear in mind that the majority of walking bass lines are improvised. So most of the time you should be making these up, you know, constructing them on the fly. But you need to get started somewhere, and, you know, learning a pre-composed line like this is a really good way of just, you know, getting used to the style, getting used to how to play these things and the kind of lines that you're going to be playing, okay? And very, very importantly, you know, as we looked at those smaller fragments, you know, one chord at a time, you know, working from one root note to the next, those individual fragments are the parts that you will absorb as or digest as your vocabulary, okay? So when you learn a line like, you know, from that point on, if you memorize that line and think, okay, well, this is a root movement by a fourth, you know, C to F. If you have to connect two chords together, it means you've got a little phrase there. You know, as I've said before, it's all about developing your vocabulary, developing phrases. You know, these are, when you first start to talk, you know, you don't know what to say. You don't have much to say. You gradually have to build up by learning the letters, and you put those together to create words, which you put together to create sentences and phrases, and before you know it, you're having a conversation. But you have to start somewhere, and these smaller fragments in there, these little journeys from one chord to the next, that's what you need to be looking at and, putting there in the musical toolbox. So hopefully that breakdown will help with memorizing that bass line, and also help with memorizing other bass lines, okay? So those tips in there, you know, breaking it down into fragments. And the next stage with this is to transpose the line, because you don't want to just learn it in C. You need to be able to play a blues in any key. So I'll be running through that in the next lesson. But in the meantime, once you've got that under your fingers, just try transposing it yourself. First of all, try something simple like moving it up a whole step, you know, to D, you know. It gets rid of using the open strings in there, and then try moving to a different key like F or G, something like that. And that's much, much trickier because you won't be able to go below the root note. So you either have to take the whole thing up the octave, or you'll have to take individual lines up the octave. So yeah, that's the next stage in this. Now, the blues practice tracks that I've got over at TalkingBass.net are in every key. So there's about 400 tracks in there covering all the different styles, you know, traditional blues, jazz blues, minor blues, they're all in there, and they're all over there at the Talking Bass store. So like I said, there's about 400 tracks in there in every key. So they'll be in C, D flat, D, E, E flat, etc. Okay, so just check those out in the meantime. Okay, so I'll see you next week.